In this video, we're going to look at social networking services, also known as social networking sites. My name is Mark Pegram, and I'll be taking you through this material. And here's the usual copyright notice that you see at the start of all of the online videos. Here's an infographic you may find interesting. It shows how the major social media services, including social networking services, are exploding. And of course, Facebook is absolutely dominant in this area. We sometimes hear nowadays that young people are moving away from Facebook. Certainly there are other social media services which skew younger in terms of their users. However, as you can see in this infographic from 2015, Facebook does still have a large number of young users. In fact, this is even clearer in this infographic from the end of 2015. What's happening is that young people are using a range of different social media platforms, but in many cases, Facebook is the hub, with posts to other social media platforms also being available on Facebook. Here's a more recent take on the same phenomenon from Mary Meeker's 2016 Internet Trends presentation. It's very clear that Facebook is the field leader among 18 to 34-year-olds in the US. Feel free to pause the video to have a closer look. And the dominance of Facebook would seem to be continuing among young people, as seen in this graph from 2017. Many of the major social networking services are gradually becoming more and more mobile services. That's certainly true of Facebook, whose CEO Mark Zuckerberg stated in 2013 that Facebook is now a mobile company. Things have certainly moved on since 2013. In 2015, for the first time, the number of mobile-only users of Facebook surpassed all other groups of users. That is, those who were accessing Facebook on desktop computers, but also those who were accessing it on desktop and mobile devices. Clearly, we are moving towards a point where we are principally accessing our social networking services on mobile devices. Facebook is not the only social networking service in the world, but it is absolutely the dominant one. Older social networking services like MySpace have in some cases reinvented themselves. In the case of MySpace, it's become something of a niche music site. Competitors to Facebook in other parts of the world, such as Korea's Cyworld, Japan's Mixi, and Russia's VK, are seeing rapidly declining user numbers in comparison to Facebook. The only exception really is China, where Facebook is banned, and local services like Renren, and more recently QQ and Weixin, which is known in the West as WeChat, have extremely large user numbers. QQ and WeChat are not exactly like Facebook, but they do fulfill many of Facebook's functions in China. We're now going to look at some general principles that underpin social networking services. Because Facebook is so absolutely dominant, we will refer mostly to Facebook, but these principles apply more broadly. And the first thing to say is that social networking services have a personal focus. Now that sounds really obvious, but actually it's an extremely important point. And it's a point which is flagged up here in this quote by Dana Boyd, who, by the way, does write her name in lowercase, exactly as you see it here, and Nicole Ellison. This personal focus is important because it represents a shift. If you think back to the old Web 1.0, web pages were mostly about topics. So you went to the web to look up Paris or to look up cars. But nowadays, with Web 2.0, many web pages are about people. And a person has their own presence online, and in their own space, they pull together their interest in Paris and their interest in cars and so on. So what we are seeing with the shift from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0 is an ongoing shift from a topic-centered web to a person-centered web. This is a quote from the more recent work of Nicole Ellison and Dana Boyd. As they point out here, because of the shift to a person-centered web, the web looks different to each of us each time we log on. You might like to pause the video and have a close look at this quote. This is Dana Boyd, who is probably the world's foremost academic expert on Facebook and on social networking in general. She now works for Microsoft Research, and a lot of her work is about social networking. She looks at it as allowing new forms of socializing. She spends quite a lot of time countering the hype that we see in the media, and she focuses a lot on educational uses. You might like to take a look at her Wikipedia entry or at her blog, and you can follow her on Twitter as well. If you'd like to read Dana's more extended work, you might like to look for her book, It's Complicated, which came out in 2014. It's possible to purchase it online, but it's also available as a free PDF download. This personal focus that we've been talking about is important because it underpins the shift towards PLNs or personal learning networks, PLEs or personal learning environments, and e-portfolios. So actually the idea of social networking sites, the idea of person-centered web pages is very important for education online. The second really important principle underpinning social networking services is that they have a networking focus. Again, this sounds really obvious, but it's really important. This is a map that Facebook released in December 2010, showing some of the main connections between Facebook users around the world. Here is a visualization created in mid-2017 of my network of connections on Facebook. It shows how each of my friends is linked to each of my other friends. And of course, all of those lines connecting people represent flows of information and communication. This is an interactive display, and you can create a display like this of your own network of friends using the Lost Circles Facebook Graph Visualizer. The networking focus of Facebook and other social networking sites is important for two interconnected reasons. First up, there's the idea of collective intelligence. You are the hub of your own network, connected to other people and to resources. The resources are represented by the laptop computer icons in this image. That means that you can draw on the collective intelligence of your network in order to help you in everyday life and your everyday work. And of course, you can also contribute to that collective intelligence by sharing your own ideas and insights. Secondly, there is a related phenomenon known as weak ties. It was established in the 1970s by the Swedish sociologist Mark Granovetter that humans have two kinds of ties to other humans. We have strong ties to those who support us emotionally in everyday life, our partners, our families, our close friends. But then we have much, much larger collections of weak ties. These are people that we know, that we might stop to say hello to in the street, but they tend not to provide a lot of emotional support in everyday life. What sociologists were able to show in the 1970s is that people who are very successful, professionally, financially, in worldly terms, tend to have very large collections of weak ties. The reason for this is that with large collections of weak ties, you have a lot of information flowing to you from many different sources. And if you need to get something done, you have a lot of people that you can call on. So weak ties are important for certain kinds of success. In the era of digital social networks, like Facebook, it's been possible for sociologists and psychologists to actually see people's collections of weak ties mapped out. And what has been found is that there is a strong correlation between success in your career, financially, and other such ways, and having a large collection of weak ties. This message has been taken on board by quite a number of educational institutions, particularly in the US and particularly at tertiary level. What you're looking at here is a Facebook check-in symbol on the campus of the University of Kentucky, and it's there to remind students to check into Facebook as often as possible. The reason for this is that if lots of the students join Facebook and if they network with each other, they will take forward with them into their future lives this kind of collection of weak ties, which can benefit their future success. It's a little bit like an old boys network or an old girls network updated for the digital era. And here's another example of one of these check-in symbols on the campus of the University of Kentucky. Interestingly, here's a similar symbol that I spotted on a recent visit to Fengchia University in Taichung, Taiwan. So this may be becoming an international phenomenon. Going beyond the principles of the personal focus and the networking focus of social networking sites, we do know that these sorts of services, and particularly Facebook, are being used already by a lot of students to support their education, to support their schoolwork, to support their homework. You can see that in this pie chart here. And here's a quote from a more recent report making the same point. I would expect that these percentages would be at least as high, and indeed probably higher, if we were to obtain data about them now. There are many teachers who feel that social networking services, and again, particularly Facebook, have a place in education, as you can see in this quote from Matt Levinson. In fact, many teachers use Facebook a little bit like a miniature VLE or a miniature LMS. This particular quote comes from an interesting book with the title From Fear to Facebook. You might like to look it up if you're interested in this topic. Matt Levinson's quote is echoed here in this more recent comment from Mike Kent, who also points out the social participatory nature of the learning that can occur through social networking sites like Facebook. Not only that, as Mike Kent points out, it is possible to make use of rich multimedia materials at the same time. It's also been noted that when students create a social networking profile, they are engaging in quite an intensive literacy exercise. This doesn't mean they have to create live profiles on Facebook. There are some other places where they can create Facebook-like profiles without actually being on a social networking site, and I'll show those to you in a little while. It's important to realize that if you are using Facebook with your students, you don't have to friend them directly. You can set up groups or pages where you can meet and interact with your students without the need for you to friend them or for them to friend each other unless they wish to do so. Many educators choose to set up Facebook groups. Here, you typically have to apply for membership and be accepted by an administrator. This is a Facebook group which was set up to train a group of transnational educators. And you can see in the post here that a PDF document was shared and people were asked to comment on it. This is another screen capture from the same group. You can see at the top of the page a multiple choice question that has been posed. In the middle, you can see a link to a website, and at the bottom, you can see a link to a YouTube video and some discussion about it. So a Facebook group can be used to distribute all kinds of multimodal materials and to foster discussion around them. This is a Facebook group which was set up by a primary art teacher I worked with in Hong Kong. She wanted to present her students with examples of art from around Hong Kong, as well as famous artworks from around the world. And the idea was to engage students in discussion about these. You can see another screen capture from the same project here. If you're interested in setting up groups on Facebook, you might like to have a look at Facebook's own guidelines on groups for schools, which you'll find at the address at the bottom of the screen. Sometimes, rather than setting up a Facebook group, you might want to set up a Facebook page. A Facebook page is typically totally public. People can like it and then receive status updates from that page in their newsfeed. This is the UWA Students page, which is used to make announcements which are of relevance to different students at UWA. But it's not just about making announcements to students. Students can respond to those announcements. They can also pose their own questions, which can be answered by UWA staff or by other students. And you can see some examples on this page here. Sometimes the questions are a little unexpected, as in this example. If you're interested in finding out more about how to use Facebook and other social networking and social media services in education, you might like to check out the social media page of the EdTech Guide at the address you'll find at the bottom of the screen. Okay, let's look at some variations on the basic idea of social networking sites. If you want students to learn about sites like Facebook without actually going on Facebook, you can use services such as the Wall Machine or a site like Fakebook. Students could set up profiles for historical characters or literary characters or even for themselves. It's a way of getting them to think through self-presentation online without actually putting anything live on Facebook or any other social networking service. If you're looking to set up a social networking group where you have more administrative control, you might like to consider Ning. Ning was very popular with educators until a few years ago when they began charging educators to set up their networks. Still, there are a number of educational Nings out there. One service which has been very popular with educators in the last couple of years is Edmodo. It looks a lot like Facebook, and students have a certain familiarity with it because of that. However, a teacher has complete administrative control of their own class area, and it is designed to be used purely for educational purposes. You can see an Edmodo page set up here by a science teacher I worked with in Perth. She has posted some movies. She's also posted a quiz for her students. This is an overview of the results of a poll conducted by an English teacher through Edmodo. It's interesting to see that nowadays you can get very detailed breakdowns of student results, and that gives you as a teacher a very clear picture of what students know and think. Or here's a history teacher I worked with, again in Perth. She's posted a discussion topic for her students to talk about. Or here's an English teacher, in fact the English teacher whose poll you saw a couple of slides ago. Her students are interacting in character. They're all taking on the roles of different characters in the story Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And here's a teacher in Hong Kong who has asked his students to submit their work through an Edmodo page. These students have created multimodal posters with Glogster, and you can see a few submissions in this screen capture. This means that other students can look at their work and ultimately be invited to comment on it. To wrap up this section on Edmodo, here's a recent account by a nursing educator of how Edmodo, with all of its social networking style features, can be used as a kind of mini virtual learning environment, and one which is very compatible with mobile devices. Of course, there are asynchronous discussion boards which can be used for different kinds of reflections and conversations. As she went on to point out, there was a good depth of discussion that emerged through some of these conversations on Edmodo. There was also the possibility of providing students with materials ahead of class in order to adopt something like a flipped approach. Here we can see the inbuilt polling options being used. And interestingly, this educator decided to make use of customizable badges as a way of motivating and engaging learners. Of course, this is a step in the direction of gamification. And indeed, gamification is flagged up here in this final slide about the use of Edmodo in this nursing course. Do feel free to pause the video and to go back to any of the preceding slides if you'd like to look at them in more detail. An alternative to Edmodo, but one which has many similarities with it, is Schoology, which has also been popular over recent years with a number of institutions and a number of teachers. You might like to check it out. Here's a teacher I worked with in Perth recently who has used Schoology to share multimodal material, in this case, a mind map. Here's an even more sophisticated example of how multimodal materials created with a different Web 2.0 service can be embedded easily within Schoology. This particular ThingLink image, which is a kind of annotated image, was embedded in a Schoology page by a teacher I worked with in Hong Kong. You might like to pause the video to read what she has to say about her use of ThingLink within Schoology. And here's another example from the same teacher. This time she's embedded a Padlet interactive board in a Schoology page. Again, feel free to pause the video to read her comments. In addition to Edmodo and Schoology, there are other similar platforms becoming available. One example, which has been quite popular in recent years with early childhood and primary teachers, is Seesaw. And if you'd like some ideas about how to use Seesaw with your students, there's a collection of tweets by teachers discussing their use of Seesaw on the top page of the Seesaw website. You might like to take a look at it. Going beyond education per se, you might also like to check out the service LinkedIn. This is a professional networking service. The idea is that you can put up information about your career, the different positions you've held, and so on. What is perhaps most interesting about LinkedIn is that the people you are connected to can endorse you for having particular skills and expertise. So, in other words, people who are looking at your profile don't just depend on what you have said about yourself, but they can get an idea about what your colleagues and other connections think about you. I think we're going to see a lot more of this kind of approach in years to come. This is a very good service to be part of if you are thinking of being mobile in your career in the future. I know of several people who have been headhunted through LinkedIn. That is also something we're going to see more of in years to come. With the advent of smart mobile devices, we're also seeing an increase in popularity of geosocial networking applications. These are applications where, like with Facebook Places, you can check in wherever you are. You can see comments and reviews and photos and videos that others have posted in the same locations. Foursquare is also being used in some educational settings, particularly for orientation tours, such as this one you can see being introduced here at Edith Cowan University in Perth. And you can see some tips from the ECU Foursquare account in this screen capture. Although Foursquare has recently made some changes to the way it operates, most of the same functionality is still available, both in Foursquare itself and in other similar geosocial apps. For more ideas about the kinds of social networking services being used by teachers and students at all levels, you might like to consult this web guide from Common Sense Graphite, which was released towards the end of 2015. You can see the address at the bottom of the screen. So, what are the main dangers of using social networking sites? You've probably heard quite a bit about this already in the media. We're just going to look briefly at 4 major areas of concern. Firstly, there's the issue of lack of privacy. Now, As reflected in this comment, which goes way back to 2001, this is not just an issue on social networking sites, but across the web. However, people do have particular concerns with social networking sites because of the amount of personal information that many people reveal there. This is something that we need to think about as educators and that we need to get our students to think about as well. In recent years, there's been a lot of debate in the media and in the research literature about the nature and importance of privacy. But here's one recent comment suggesting just why privacy is so important, and why, therefore, all of us need to think about protecting ourselves online and ensuring that we are using the privacy controls that are available to us. For some recent insights into what's going on in the background here, you might like to consult this article at the address you can see at the bottom of the screen. It's also important that we think about the dangers of the commodification of our data and indeed our attention. Secondly, there's the issue of collapsed context. This is a term that comes from Dana Boyd, whom we spoke about earlier. Normally, in the real world, we present ourselves very differently to different audiences. So I wouldn't speak the same way to my friends or my family as I'm speaking now in this video. The problem with a social networking service is that all of your audiences are collapsed into one. So you might be friends with your partner, your kids, your boss, your colleagues, your ex-schoolmates, and so on. And it's very difficult to know how to address all of those people appropriately at the same time. And this is why we sometimes hear horror stories about people losing their jobs, for example, because they've said something that would be fine to say to a friend, but is not fine to say in front of their boss or some of their colleagues. So collapsed contexts are certainly an issue. Continuous partial attention is also an issue which is relevant across the web and especially with many Web 2.0 tools. And if you've looked at some of the other videos provided, you may have come across this term before. It was coined by Linda Stone, who argues that nowadays we rarely pay full attention to anyone or anything. Instead, we pay continuous partial attention to a lot of different information and communication channels. And that has real consequences for all sorts of areas of our lives, ranging from personal relationships through to reflective academic thought. This is Linda Stone. She comes from a technology background. She's held some pretty high-powered positions with Apple as a senior researcher and also as a vice president of Microsoft. She is not against technology, but she is arguing that we need to use technology in a balanced way. She's best known for her theory of continuous partial attention, but she does a lot of work in this general space. You might like to take a look at her Wikipedia entry, to look up her website, or to follow her on Twitter. If you'd like to hear an introduction to Linda Stone's concept of continuous partial attention in her own words, pause this video and go to the video that you see at the link at the bottom of the screen. The first half of this short video is all about continuous partial attention. Fourthly, it's argued here by Alice Marwick that Web 2.0 services create particular types of people, and social networking services really lead the field when it comes to training ourselves, training each other, training our students to harness marketing techniques to boost attention and visibility. Of course, this is a larger philosophical concern, but it ties into very practical concerns about privacy and surveillance, such as those concerns that we mentioned a few moments ago. As is pointed out here, we need to think about the effects of this kind of self-configuration to be watched and consumed by others. So, pulling all of this together, we can say that social networking sites like Facebook facilitate interaction and collaboration, and they can be used a bit like miniature VLEs. The social networking principle underpins the move towards PLNs, PLEs, and e-portfolios, and is therefore very important for education. Recently, there's been a move towards mobile social networking on a large scale. On the downside, There are issues around digital privacy, collapsed context, continuous partial attention, and the nature of corporate citizenship and the self-marketing that it requires. If you'd like more information about social networking in education, including a summary of the main points made in this video, as well as links to key services, you might like to go to the social networking page of the Digital Learning website. You can see the address at the bottom of the screen.